Hello and welcome to the Business of Authority. I'm Jonathan Stark.
And I'm Rochelle Moulton.
And today we're going to talk about knowing when to quit.
Man, what a difference that makes.
Mm-hmm. Not that anything we're going to tell you today will make it much easier, but...
Intellectually, you'll know that you're making a good move.
Yes, intellectually. So last week we started talking about kind of the opposite of this, which is Seth Godin's The Dip and how to decide to be the best in the world so that you know the juice is worth the squeeze. Like you're going to get through the dip. You're going to plow through the dip because you're on this mission to become better than mediocre. You want to be the one. So that's fine. But there's the flip side to that is that there are probably a lot of things that are a lot of decisions you're going to make or things you're going to commit to that make sense to quit. And intellectually speaking, well, I think culturally speaking and gut instinct thinking, that goes against a lot of cultural norms. I mean, especially in the United States, but I'm sure it's not limited to the United States, of like, quitters don't win and winners don't quit. And calling someone a quitter is kind of like calling them a loser. And it's just, it's frowned upon. But intellectually, you can imagine that there are of course times when people should quit things, and it's I would say always easier to see when someone else, you think someone else should quit something. It's like, you've been trying to become an actor for 40 years and you've had one walk-on part. I think it might be time to quit. It's like before it's too late. Or, me with music at a certain point, it was just like, okay, could the writing be in bigger flashing neon lights on the wall than it is? I don't think so.
Sometimes it's quieter lights. I think, it's easy to kick ourselves that we didn't see the flashing neon, but there's lots of smaller lights too. And that was sort of the point in the dip, is that when you say no or you quit, those things, even the small ones, it gives you the energy, the time, the commitment to really spend your time on the big thing worth doing, the thing that you're willing to work to be the best in the world at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a book on this that I really liked by Annie Duke called Quit, and it is purposely the flip side of Angela Duckworth's Grit, which I love the symmetry of those two, like rhyming four-letter words that mean the opposite. So there's so Grit. Angela Duckworth came out with this book Grit. I'm going to say it was like maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And it was about the stick-to-itiveness that you'd expect from this entrepreneurial story, the myth of the entrepreneur, like sticking to it and not believing any of the naysayers and getting through the dip and getting to the other side. And so Annie Duke in interviews has said that, she agrees with Angela that you should have grit when it comes to things that are working, but if you've made a bet on something that turns out not to be working, then you should quit so that you can free up your resources to go do something that might work, have a bigger impact, which is, we're sort of talking about opportunity cost there, where it's like, if you spend your time trying to become a famous musician, you're not at the same time also trying to become a pro tennis player or whatever, or, run a successful chain of laundromats, or all the other things you could do that potentially would have a bigger impact on your life or other people's lives. You're kind of like pre-quitting those things to be a famous musician. So you're always sort of making this decision one way or the other. And she talks about, in the book Quit, she talks about a whole bunch of cognitive biases that, even beyond the cultural "you're a loser if you quit" type of thing, really work against it's almost like this subconscious, it feels like gut instinct or common sense, but it's totally irrational, and it works against your rational mind making what is probably the safe bet or the right decision, which would be to quit something that's not working. There's a ton of them that she talks about, but the one that really gets me, and even though I'm intellectually aware of it, I still have to, through sheer force of will, remove it from my decision making when I'm making a big decision, and that is sunk cost.
Mm-hmm.
Probably everybody's familiar with the term sunk cost. Maybe not. The idea of sunk cost is that the more you make a decision and you start pouring resources into it. It could be time, it could be money, it could be reputation. And the more you sink into this decision, the less likely you are to be able to change course, because you've got this escalating commitment every time you every time you take an action to double down on this decision. It's like you're sinking money or time or reputation into this thing. And especially the more public it is, and especially the more outside of the norm it is, the harder it is to frankly admit it was a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And realize the losses. So this is, I love the sort of market metaphor where I remember saying to I think it was probably my father, it might've been my uncle, where they were complaining about the market being down. And I was like, well, so what? Just don't sell it. Like, don't sell the stocks if the market's down. And then you won't realize the losses, right? Just wait. And it'll either go down more or it'll go up. But you obviously bet on it at one point. It's probably just a phase and it'll go back up. So just wait, right? Why not just wait? And that, I think, is certain. Well, first of all, they were at an age where they couldn't just wait because they needed it to be throwing off a certain amount of dividends per
They needed
month.
the cash.
And they needed the cash, right? So they had to sell something because the dividends it was throwing off were insufficient for their lifestyle. So they have to eat into it, which they didn't like. So I didn't understand that in the first place. But even beyond that, at a certain point, it makes sense to cut your losses and take that money and put it into something that is perhaps going to perform better. And it's like the classic poker thing where Andy Duke is a championship poker player. No surprise there, where, you got to know when to fold them, and know when to hold them, and know when to fold them. And if you never fold them, you are going to lose, like the big picture. You're not going to win anything. You have to make the decision to be, your money's in the center of the table. And you're like, I'm not going to, the odds are very high that I'm not going to win this hand. So I better cut my losses. And people just don't want to do that in real life or like normal decisions because of sunk cost, because they feel like when I was younger, when I was like, just don't sell the stock, they feel like they haven't lost anything until they take until they walk away from the table and they or throw in the towel or whatever metaphor you want. It's like folding is admitting you made a bad decision. You made a bad bet.
Yeah. I think maybe the market example is where, and I am so guilty of this, where you bought a stock, you bought an individual stock, and I used to have a handful of them. And when the market was going up, I started to realize those individual stocks that I had chosen were not going up as fast as the market. I was better off in my index fund. But I would say, so if I sell that, then I kind of have to admit that was a bad decision. And it's not at the price I want it to be. Maybe I would lose money if I sold it. But if I do, and I trade it for this index over here, I'm pretty sure it's going to go up over time. It may be a roller coaster, but it's going to go up, whereas I don't know what's going to happen with this one. Selling that stock becomes really hard because there goes the image of the swashbuckling investor making money, being smarter than everybody else. And I was laughing because this has happened to me more than once, as you can tell. I only have one stock left now, one individual stock. But it's even when you're just telling the story to yourself, you're not telling anybody else, it's still so hard to bite that bullet. And then if you add in the public nature of some of these kinds of things, it's understandable why people get entrenched in not quitting.
Right. Yeah. So the classic example of sunk cost is like, I'll see if I can tell it. Maybe at some point we'll get Annie on the show. She could tell it right. But the classic example is you spend $200 for tickets to a Foo Fighters concert at Fenway outdoors. And, that's in January. You buy those tickets in January. The show doesn't come around until June. And the day of the show, it is like freezing rain and just miserable out, dangerous conditions on the road. And you're like, should I go? The decision is, should I go? So now if somebody...
This is a terrible example because if you're a fan, you're going to go anyway.
Maybe not.
You cannot call yourself a fan if you have tickets for Foo Fighters and don't go.
Well, so let's say it's let's say you're going to have a bad time.
Okay.
You're definitely going to have a bad time. So you have to decide to go or not go. I think the intuition, is most people are going to go. And to be honest, it wouldn't be $200 for Foo Fighters. It would be $800.
Yeah.
So you're at $1,000 basically. Do you go or not go? You absolutely shouldn't go. Like it's not even close, because you're not getting the $200 or the $800 back either way. So you can.
It's gone.
It's gone. It's a sunk cost. You can't get a refund. No refunds. The $800 is gone. So now the choice is, do I want to have a bad night in the freezing rain and maybe get sick or skid out on the highway? Or do I want to stay home and eat popcorn and binge watch Netflix? The $800 is gone. So you're either going to be out $800 and nearly freeze to death, or you're going to be out $800 and cozy on your couch. So the part of the reason why, or one way to look at the difficulty in staying home and eating popcorn, is that you're forced to admit that you made a bet. You bet $800 that you were going to have an amazing night in June, and it turned out that that's impossible. So it was just it might have been a reasonable bet, but it turned out that, the fortune did not smile on you. And in no world, if you remove sunk cost from the equation, no one goes to that concert. Mm-hmm. But even like intellectually, I understand that, but still I'm sitting there like, well, and then you tell yourself all these stories. Well, I'll dress warm. It'll be fine. I've got 4-wheel drive. Probably a lot of people will bail, so it won't be that busy on the roads. You tell all of these stories, even though you're going to have a bad night, or it's definitely not the night that you were planning to have. Mm-hmm. And if you could see into the future and retrospectively say, if you could like time machine to a week after the show, and there you are with pneumonia, and it was a terrible time. The band only played for 15 minutes because the instruments all froze. You're like, I could have had a nice night, or I could have had that bad night, or I could have had a nice night. Either way, I'm out the $800. So it's like, you're going to pick the nice night. You should.
Yeah. Yeah. The sunk costs are just really, really hard. And when you think about it and when you think about it with your business, you say, oh, I just put $5,000 into developing this course. And okay, I can write that off. But what about everything I said to my list about this course? What about the 17 email series I sent over the last few months working up to this? And now I just have to just cut it. What about all that? And again, it's every single time. I know it feels so impossible. It's like we have to look back at that and go, damn. That didn't work. Now, you can do a post-mortem, right? And you can do an autopsy and you can say, well, why didn't it work? I'm thinking of something that I dropped and like, duh, it didn't work because I didn't do any freaking research to make sure anybody even wanted this thing. Like, so I learned this, expensive lesson in a way, but I learned it forever. Right. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, you get to that point. It's emotionally challenging, but the people who are most successful learn how to quit strategically. Strategic quitting. Yeah.
There's something I notice, especially with in the sales cycle for folks who do bigger projects where they have longer sales cycles, that I was always hyper aware of being really careful of avoiding, which was getting emotionally involved, not emotionally involved, but just this escalation of commitment. Whenever there was like looked like it would be a great client, could be a great client, but it just kept dragging out. I would be very, very, I would consciously not, what's the word? I would be very hands off in terms of pursuing it. I would think about it as little as possible. That's the right way to put it. I would think about it as little as possible, because I knew the more I put into the sales process, the more sunk cost there was going to be. And if it eventually came to a negotiation, that would be working against me, because I'd be saying to myself, oh, I put all this time into this. I flew to Florida to meet with the people in person. I put together reports. I've been boning up on stuff for this client in case I land the gig and I can hit the ground running. All of this, the kind of stuff that people who pitch do all the time. Like they'll spend an entire weekend with their whole team putting together a giant a beautiful 40-page deck that they're going to present to the client on Monday in like a beauty contest format. And it's like when you do that, it puts you at a disadvantage when it comes time to talk turkey, because you feel like you've got all of this investment in the deal and you don't want to lose it. You don't want to admit to yourself that it was a bad bet. And it just makes it way harder to hold your guns. It makes it way harder to walk away. It makes it way harder to see red flags. So I would always try and keep a very loose, very light touch in an extended sales process.
Well, it's even harder if you have employees.
Sure. Well, if you got payroll.
Well, no, it's not even the payroll. It's the emotional thing. I mean, I've worked in teams like this for years before I went solo, where we're trying to get a big marquee client and we're doing exactly what you said, not a beauty contest so much, but a proposal, an in-depth proposal, what we're going to do, what's the process, what does it look like, who's going to be on it, what are the outcomes? And you meet with them and you go through that whole thing and you pour your heart and soul into it, and then you don't win. Mm-hmm. And if you own the firm or you're the leader of that team, you know, that's a downer. Right. And so you have to figure out what that means. And again, I'm putting the money aside. I'm talking about the emotional piece of fully investing in getting a client and coming back with an empty bag. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the quitting piece, though, is if they started to negotiate with you. And at what point, because in this case, you get sent away from the table. From a quitting standpoint, it's like, okay, we're at the table. At what point should we walk away?
Yes. Yeah. And it's really hard.
Yeah, because you're still walking back with an empty bag, but this time it was your decision.
Yeah. Well, and it's how much do you throw onto the table? Right? How much? I'm not good with poker, so I don't think I can use the analogy. But I'm picturing like the player with all the chips pushing them into the center of the table, betting it all, yeah, right? Because you get to the point where you say, "Oh, okay, so if we did this, could you add in customer interviews?" Well, yeah, sure, we could do that. That would be like $50,000. Oh, that seems like kind of a lot. Could you make it maybe 20? And so you start having like those kinds of conversations, or at least the client feels like they can host those kinds of conversations. Yeah.
Right. So we talked about something a long time ago that this piece of the conversation reminded me of, and it was the conversation with Paul Jarvis where he tested the idea for Fathom Analytics with a tweet. Yeah. And like small tests, listening tours, these little things that take, not much of an ante in the middle of the table, not much of a commitment, not much of a resource hog, to just take the next step to like experiment, to test cheaply and quickly. So you're not overly invested in this thing. It to me is the move that helps avoid needing to quit something later, because you're just not that attached to it in the first place. Oh, I've got a great idea. And you tweet about it, crickets. You ask a couple of people on your mailing list if they'd like to talk about it, crickets. You're like, well, maybe you do a couple of things, maybe a couple of phone interviews, and you're just like, well, no one, I don't know if I just don't know how to explain this correctly, but nobody, this is only interesting to me for some reason.
Yeah.
And and it's not like this huge public commitment that you need to like backpedal from or reverse from. So keeping the testing small is safer for the reasons that we discussed at the time, which is you're just not wasting a lot of time and money. But it does help with the sunk cost issue because there's just not that much to walk away from. So you've only got a few chips on the table. So it's no big deal. It's just like, this is an experiment, didn't work out. And if you keep doing those, eventually one is going to be not crickets. One is going to be take my money, and you're going to be like, oh, this seems like a good thing to pursue.
It's interesting whenever I talk about the listening tour to somebody lately, the concept of one, a lot of people are like, yeah, but I'm asking them, I'm taking their valuable time. Like, I feel like I'm taking, and I don't know. And it's this idea that it's better to go off by yourself in a room and not bother anybody, and then come back. And even if it bombs, you did the right thing because you didn't bother anybody. And right. Yeah. And that's just no. The right people will say yes to a call or some kind of an interaction. Maybe it's just email on your version of a listening tour. And if they won't, then it doesn't matter how good your idea is. Then you need to spend some time getting these people to want to take your calls and want to talk to you. And so you get information either way. But I think the key is not to assume that going off by ourselves until we come up with the quote unquote perfect solution is the way to go. Right?
Yeah, I mean, that is hiding, right? So it's like, and it doesn't even pass the sniff test, because if you go into your room and you dream up this perfect thing, and you're going to have to go out to the exact same people and ask for their money. So why wouldn't you do it first and just ask for a few minutes of their time when they could perhaps contribute to making the thing better for them, right? Or at least
Yes.
finding out that you won't be wasting their time later when you've built the thing, you have massive sunk costs, and you're trying to sell it and no one cares because it doesn't solve a problem that anyone actually has.
Well, and you can get great pricing information too. Pricing information that can make you go, whoa, I should price this higher, which is one of the things I heard when I did one of my listening tours. Or you can also hear, oh, I think it's worth this. And you had in mind a price that was 5 times higher. So all of a sudden you can't make the numbers work at that price. If you hear that consistently, you're like, I don't think I can make this work. All right, I need to think of something else. But each one of those interviews that you did, you got a bunch of gold. And I know in my own case and a couple of clients, we used very specific comments that people made in the marketing of it, like in the sales page, in some of the emails, because the people you talk to, if they're the right people for your thing, will help position your thing for you. Right? They'll give you some of the language. They'll tell you why it's for them or why it's not for them. It's just pure gold.
Right. So that might be a good segue into my next bullet point here. So the first bullet point, we sort of skimmed over it pretty quickly, but like the cultural norms is the first one. Like if you picture, I don't think we said this, but in the cultural norms thing, if you think like quitting is for losers, it's like maybe reframe that in your mind in terms of knowing when to quit. Maybe reframe that in your mind as a pivot, because that's what pivots are. Pivots are quitting the original idea and pivoting to a different one. Maybe it's a big pivot or a little pivot, but startups do it all the time. And it's not frowned upon for a startup to pivot, because just culturally speaking, that community is just telling themselves a different story. So you should try and tell yourself that same story. If you tell yourself that same story that you're pivoting, then it might be less painful to quit. So that was the first bullet point, is just like the cultural norms around it. The second one was being aware of sunk costs and through sheer force of will, removing it from your decision making, if at all possible, to at least be aware of when you're succumbing to it, and perhaps proactively minimizing your sunk costs by doing small experiments, going on a listening tour, not overinvesting in a sales cycle, all these sorts of things. The next one, which I feel like you're segueing us right into, is what Annie Duke would call a kill criteria. So defining, her pitch on this, and it rings true to me, is that humans are terrible at making decisions when they're in the middle of something. They're much better at making decisions way in advance. So because you're not emotionally invested, you haven't got the sunk cost yet.
Right.
So if you set kill criteria for the decision, like, if I go this many hands into the poker game and I haven't got at least a pair, I'm folding. Or if, whatever it is with the musician thing, like for me, it's like, if I go for 2 years and I can't get a song on the radio, forget it, or whatever. I'm going to kill it. Or somebody who, flies to Hollywood to be, or, moves to Hollywood to be an actor. And if I'm still waiting on tables in 3 years, I'm going to quit. So it's much easier to set those things before you've invested all the time than 3 years later when you're down in the weeds and you have massive amounts of sunk cost and you can't see the forest for the trees. So this is still hard if you're listening to this and you're currently in the middle of something that maybe you're wondering, maybe I should quit this. It's very difficult to set the kill criteria now. So the question I ask myself in this scenario is, if I knew then what I know now, would I decide today to make the same decision, or would I make a different decision? And if your answer is that you'd make a different decision today, then you should definitely quit, because you're maybe there's a reason that I can't think of, but it seems to me that if you wouldn't make the same decision again today based on new information, better information, then the only thing keeping you there is sunk cost.
Well, sunk cost plus the psychology of it. And because the psychology could also be the people who are invested in it with you.
True. Yes. Okay. That's good.
Yeah. It's all of that. It can be hard to separate in your head. especially
That's
if
true.
those people are really significant in your life.
Or employees and you're folding a business.
Oh, yeah. Well, I know what it was like when I sold my business with employees. And that was that was very, very emotional. Yeah. That was not a simple transaction.
It doesn't, agreed. So you're right. There's a bunch of things that could be going on there. But think of how pure and clear this is. If I would not start this business again today, why are you deciding to continue? So like another great one, I think I even did a comic on this one. It goes something like this. The dog says, I feel like I should quit this, or no, this business is not going the way I wanted it to. My freelancing business is not going well. And the snail says, well, if you were going to start over today, would you start the same business? The dog says, absolutely not. And the snail says, well, then you should quit and do something different. And the snail says, I never can do this. I can never tell the comic. The dog says, I'm not ready to make that big of a decision. And the snail says, you're making that decision every day. You're just picking the wrong choice. So the point being that every day that you get up and decide to pursue this thing that you wouldn't even start, you are making a decision to continue down this path. It is a decision. It's not not making a decision.
Well, and there's another piece in there too, which we haven't talked about, which is fear. And the fear is, okay, if I stop doing this, what do I do next?
That's true. Yeah. So
and that's what keeps people in terrible jobs, in terrible relationships, in businesses that don't fit them, in roles that just really are bad for them. It's that fear of, okay, but what do I do next?
Yeah. Right. So if you're not feeling the opportunity cost, then it makes it increases the fear. So what do I mean by that? If you are, it's kind of like if you get a bad client, prospective client, they've got red flags all over them, but you need the money and you don't have another potential client behind them. Like they're the only one. It makes it way harder to say no to them, even though you know that would be the right choice.
Right.
So in that same scenario, when you get a red flag prospect that comes through the door and you have 30 more interviews with clients this week, then you can start to feel the reality of opportunity cost, because you're spoiled for choice. There's so many options that picking the wrong one feels tangibly bad in the short term. But if there's no other opportunity that you're aware of, then I feel like most people I talk to, when I say opportunity cost, they kind of cock their head like, what? That doesn't make sense. And this is because I have so many people that don't get enough leads. So if you get lots of leads, you really feel the opportunity cost, because it's like, well, there's probably an ideal buyer in this list of 30 people who want to talk to me this week. There's probably like a dream client in here. So as soon as you see one that's got some obvious red flags, you're just like, no thanks, because that would be low profit for me. It would probably be bad for the prospect. It's a bad fit. So why would I spend my time and effort on this thing that's a bad fit when I could spend my time and money and reputation on a probability that there is going to be a dream client, or at least a better client in this list of interviews that I have this week. So if you don't, okay, so back to your point of like quitting, whether it's a relationship or a business or a product or a project or whatever it might be. If there's no obvious alternative, right? There's no obvious thing that you would switch to, makes it way harder. But again, it's one of those things that through sheer force of will makes a lot of sense to remove from your decision-making process. Like if you hear yourself saying, but I don't know what else I would do instead, quitting the thing that you're doing now that you wouldn't start again today, knowing what you know now, is probably blocking out opportunities that you're unaware of. So like you don't have the space to think of something cooler. You don't have the time to interview people. You don't have,
That's where the fear comes from. It's like, uh-oh.
Right.
And especially if you're running at 90 miles an hour and you're going to come to a complete stop, it's like, what do I do? I guess just 2 words: genius zone. Chances are that whatever this thing is not in your genius zone.
Right.
And maybe it's giving you some big old neon flashing signs that are cues to what is your genius zone? Or in this case, it's what's not your genius zone. So it could be the opposite. It could be, 180 degrees. It could be 90 degrees change. But yeah, that's the thing. And that's the thing I find people are so afraid of, is what happens if I just stop? What am I, forget the money. What am I going to do with that time? Who am I? When, especially if this was a big thing versus like a little experiment, like who am I if that doesn't work? And let me tell you, when I sold my firm, all those things went through my head. Like, who am I if I don't run a business anymore? It was part of my identity. Like, what is that? Who am I now? Or who will I be? And is that somebody that I want to be? And so, yeah, you really do, not you, we really have to lean in to those spaces, and sometimes just saying, okay, I have to stop this, I have to quit, is an incredible act of courage that you wind up never regretting.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of examples, big and small, where in my own life and in friends, family, students, colleagues, where in retrospect, quitting was the smartest, like so great, so great. It was like such a big growth, like a quantum leap forward. It's almost like shedding. I mean, depending on how shackling the thing was, it can be like a huge weight off your shoulders. So like I think of a million things. Like for me, the music thing, like letting that go was huge. I mean, just life alteringly better. I've had personal experience and with a number of students and colleagues where we have sort of fired a client where and refunds were involved and these sorts of things, and 100% across the board, instantly every single one of us was like, that was great. Like, it stunk having to send that $10,000 back or whatever, but wow, was that the right thing to do? Instantly feel better, and then you're freed up, and like that kind of stuff, that kind of like albatross project, I'm not going to say client, because it's not necessarily the client. It can just be like a miscalculation, and it's like this albatross, this like weight around your neck, and you can just take it off, right? And then you're like, whoa, it literally feels light. You feel lighter.
Yes.
And then all these possibilities, that I like your point about the fear of not knowing what to do next. Like, all these possibilities flow into that vacuum that's created. It's, it's not magic, but it does. I mean, hope rationally it makes sense that if your brain is not weighed down and depressed or like anxious or agitated by this situation that you're in, then it's more open to positive things that you can look around and compare these new possibilities with this bad experience that you're just getting out of, and think like, oh wow, there's like a lot of different things you could do, but it's very difficult. It can be very difficult to see them when you're all mired down in this like tar pit.
Yeah, it's you really do have to trust yourself in those situations, that you are strong enough, you are smart enough, you are talented enough, that when it all goes to hell, you will figure it out. Because everybody has these kinds of cycles, these ups and these downs, these trials where you think, I'm never going to get out of this mess, but you will. You will. And that's part of really, thinking it through and making that strategic decision to quit versus a reactive quitting, right?
Yes.
It's like when
that's funny.
It's like when it's just sort of, you can't just be bothered to quit. There's that too. There's that. I think of it as like being a zombie. Have you ever seen that?
What do you mean? No.
But so you quit when it's painful is how I think of reactive quitting, but you can also stick with it when you just can't be bothered to quit. Like, you're lazy. Like, I've met a lot of people like that in the course of my life, where you sit down with them and they complain about their job, they complain about their boss, they complain about the company. Say, have you thought about leaving? Oh, no. What would I complain about then? Where would I direct my energy? Right?
Yeah. Now I get it.
Yeah.
That's a funny. Yeah, go ahead.
Really, that's the thought, is that it becomes so comfortable to stay where you are that you just never get up the energy to actually quit. And you just live a life of, I don't even know what to say, like meh, you know?
Yeah.
It's just not, you're not in your genius zone. You're not contributing to the world. And by the way, this can be the same thing with a relationship, like a dead end relationship. And
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
it's when you work and you work and you work and nothing much changes, whether it's a job or a relationship. And, you know, that's just keeping you from doing something better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the reactive quitting story that came to mind when you said that was, I remember there was one day, so like Cooper, my son is in a leadership program at the karate school, and when he started school this year, it was not, the timing was not great. Like he would get out of school and he didn't have time. He had too much time, and he had enough time to fall asleep, but not enough time to really take a nap. And so I was always waking him up to go to the thing, and he was, and many times, well, maybe not many times, but at least 2 or 3 times we were in the car. And he was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to do leadership anymore. And I was like, you can make that decision, but not right now. Because it was like, it's the worst moment. Like he's tired and cranky and just emotional and like frustrated. And I'm like, now's not the time to make that decision. Like if you we can talk about it over the weekend. And if you really want to do that, that is up to you. But not in that moment. That's not the moment to make the decision. It's like you need some distance from it.
Well, yeah, that's wise dad move. And I like to think that as we grow and mature, we don't make those kinds of decisions in the moment. But, you know, some of us have.
Oh, sure. Of course.
We've made a spur of the moment decision that we might regret later. But
yeah, it's easy to get lost in that. And which brings us to my final point that I got from the book in terms of helping you know when to quit, which was that she recommends getting a quitting coach, which I think the name of that's kind of funny, but the idea of at least getting...
That's not a kind of coach I'd want to be, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, maybe she picked those words because it's kind of funny, but yeah. But the idea of getting input from someone you trust who understands what's going on, but is impartial to the situation. Like they have no skin in the game.
Yeah.
And you might, if I don't think we talked about this while the recording light was flashing, but you probably, dear listener, you can probably think of someone who from the outside, it seems like it's obvious that they should end their relationship or a business partnership or something that they're doing. It just seems obvious from the outside. And maybe you definitely don't know all the details, but that might put you in a better position than them because you're not wrestling with sunk costs. And you're, like you said before, Rochelle, like the person who's complaining about their job or their business every time you talk to them, it might be super obvious to someone from the outside who's not got all the cognitive biases that the potential quitter might have. So you can, as an outsider, I'm imagining the listener, I certainly have had the experience of feeling like, I wonder what, this person probably should quit, like, or at least consider it. And if you've had that experience, then you recognize that it might, when the tables are turned, it probably would help to talk to someone who's not emotionally invested in the decision.
Yes. And
can have some clarity around, or at least talk you through, like, well, what is the expected future value of staying the course? Knowing what you know now, what's the expected future value? Would you start this today if you knew then what you know now? Or would you start this today knowing what you know now?
And I just want to add a piece there, though. I want to make sure it's not just money. It's also how you spend your time, how you feel about it, the impact you're making. So it's not just the money.
Right. It's all the things. What really would be the fallout if you did quit this? It's been my experience that the fallout is a lot less than you think it's going to be when you quit something. Like no one cares. It's like, by and large, no one cares. Certainly no one cares as much as you think they're going to in your head. So someone who you trust, who's familiar with the details, would perhaps be a good person to talk to. She even mentions a therapist, and depending on the kind of quit you're talking about, therapists can be really good for this sort of thing to help you think it through. But so getting outside input, setting kill criteria in advance, forcing yourself to ignore sunk costs when evaluating the decision, and trying to inoculate yourself from the cultural pull, the gravitational pull of like never quit anything. I mean, that list of things, I think that is a really good summary of the tools, at least that in this case the author would bring to bear on a situation. And I don't know, I don't know if this is specific enough to be helpful yet. Do you feel like, can we come up with maybe some examples? I feel like this is still kind of high level and hand wavy.
Well, yeah, I'm thinking of a friend of mine and in terms of cultural things. And she said, my family gathered rocks on vacation, and we thought that was fun. And, basically she talked about when they would go on vacation, they would work really, really physically hard. They would, I think it was on some kind of mission kind of trips. And so it's always been interesting to me that it was really hard for her to quit things. Like it was super, super hard. And I saw it, as a friend, I just saw it rolling out into behaviors where you might accept things that you wouldn't otherwise. Like, let's take an example. A client starts to ask you to do things that you really don't want to do. They're not in your genius zone, or you're doing them and you're not charging what they really cost you. Or you can't sleep at night. You have some kind of anxiety from the work that you're creating, or you have this big gnawing, is that all there is? And, we talked to Seth Godin about, the song of significance. And for a lot of people, after they've been doing this for a while, they might have this struggle. I shouldn't say this, whatever they're doing, that they're thinking about quitting. They might say, can I really have the impact in the world that I want to have with this? Is this how I derive my significance in the work sphere or the personal sphere? It's those kinds of questions, I think. And when you can, that's why I think therapists are so helpful with this. You can say, oh yeah, we moved giant boulders on our vacations. No wonder why I don't quit anything. I think it's supposed to be hard, and the harder it is, the better it is. Of course I'm not going to quit. So, when you understand culturally where you come from and how you're feeling about these things that you're deciding whether to quit or not, I think it's really important to understand all those pieces and to have your eye firmly on the ball. And by that, I mean, you don't have to know what it is that you want next. You just have to know that this is not it. This thing that you're doing, it's not it.
Yeah, that brings up a nuance from the book that I think is interesting. It perhaps applies, which is that there's certain things that it's sort of easier. There's sort of like really specific goals, and then there's these sort of more specific. They're still specific, but they're much broader. They have more latitude to them. So like, and a classic example is like, I want to be an Olympic sprinter, right? I want to, get the 440 or whatever. I don't know any races. I don't know. I can't think of a race.
They do meters now, 400 meters. But
400 meters. Okay, let's say that's a thing. Like, I want to be an Olympic athlete that runs the 400 meters. It's like that one would be very easy to kill because there's a very small number of paths to that. So it would be very easy to set kill criteria. So like, if you're not running, you could just do the research. Like, what is the baseline experience for people that have made it to that level in the past? Like, they were running a 4-minute mile in high school or something, or by age whatever. And there's just not that many paths to that goal because it's a more finite kind of game. But the more infinite game type stuff, like I want to put a dent in the universe. Well, that's okay. Great. There's like a million ways you could do that potentially. So with a more, that's specific in a certain sense. Like it's like, it's kind of specific in the sense of the things it leaves out. Like that's very different from I want to become a billionaire. Like that might come from putting a dent in the universe, but that's not the goal. If the goal is to, whatever the goal is, put a dent in the universe, there's like the opportunity cost thing starts to crop up. It's like, well, how am I going to do that? Which path do I take? There's like, I can see 3 paths in front of me that could potentially lead there. What can I do to test the different things? There's very, very difficult to baseline something like that. There's a lot of flexibility in how you do that. So pivoting, let's call it pivoting on your way to that ultimate goal becomes a necessity, right? So like I guess what I'm trying to illustrate here is there are different types of goals. Some have an extremely small number of paths to reach them, and some have tons of ways to reach them. And the ones that have the small path, the Olympic thing, is probably much more straightforward to quit, because you can say, like, the kill criteria is so obvious. You know, it's like,
It's measurable.
super obvious, right? If you do it, right? Like, if you let go of the myth of, like, you know, winners don't quit, it's like, yeah, but I'm never going to make it in the NBA, right? So, like, if that's my dream, it's not going to happen, right? There's just in no universe is that going to happen. So if I were constantly, like, you know, I don't know, training for that or something, and all of my friends would be like, dude, give it up, you know, or like, in the book, she gives the example of Muhammad Ali, and, you know, how he just kept fighting for way too long. And like the downside is obvious, or was obvious, versus someone like Seinfeld, who quit at the top of his game because his kill criteria, whether he said it in advance or not, his kill criteria was obvious to him, which was like, we're right at that point where we are, I don't think he would have said phoning it in, but he's done some really good interviews about how he quit that show at the peak of popularity. And he was like, because I can't remember what his kill criteria was, but he had one. He was like, and it was like they were going to start phoning it in, or there was something that happened, and he was just like, nah, this is it. 9 seems like a good number. Chappelle did it. A lot of like and if you hear his story about it, he was like, when he quit the Chappelle show, he was like, that was career suicide. He left the country because everybody was telling him he was crazy. He went on like a retreat basically to get away from everybody, and comes back and gets like, I don't know, $20 million deal from Netflix or something. So anyway, the point I'm making here is like, the type of goal that you have can make it easier or harder to know what the kill criteria is or are. And I think also having a broader goal makes the quitting less and the pivoting more. So it feels more like pivoting than quitting, where you're kind of like iterating toward the goal. Like I'm doing like a big squiggle with my hand, like a big up and down squiggle, but the squiggle is getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And then it's like straight line to the goal, where each one of those turns in the squiggle is like a pivot or a quit of you found yourself in a dead end or a cul-de-sac, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna back out of here. And it's not efficient. I think I wonder if
that's the thing, is that I think there is a value judgment a lot of us make that, oh, it should be easier. It should be. I look at so-and-so and so-and-so, and it was easy for them. They're there and they're 25 years old and they're where I want to be at 40, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't work that way for almost no one gets it on the first try, like figures it out and just has a pretty straightforward trajectory, still having some roller coasters, but not like the really lows. It's human. It's the human experience to have this continue, to keep, I like the way you talked about the pivot. I think that's what it is. I think we tend to think of a pivot as being this sharp turn, but it doesn't have to be super sharp. It could be a 45-degree turn. Right? That you're just saying no to some of the things that you did, and you're saying a bigger yes to the things that you want to move forward. That's what this is. It's an iterative process, and that probably makes it sound really hard. And some days it is, and other days you just take a leap forward, and you're like, oh my God, all that time I spent navel gazing, trying to decide what to do next, it's all come together, and I see it now. This is it. Here's the leap. Witnessing that's amazing.
That does kind of tie into a common theme here, which is sort of the other side of the coin, where there's this type of, it's like a mindset where folks want to know something's going to work before they decide to do it. So it's almost like they're hypersensitive to sunk cost, and they don't want to take any risk. So like, I need to know, like, this happens all the time with lots of people with positioning. Especially if they're trying to specialize on a particular target market, and they're like, but I don't know if this is the right target market. And I'm like, yeah, correct. You don't. So how are we going to find out?
Yeah.
And well, I don't want to waste all this time, researching plastic surgeons if that's not going to be the right fit. It's like, well, I don't know what to tell you. Like, there's no directory of like, this is the perfect fit for you. you need to kind of do these small experiments. You need to do something to find out. And it's a common question, and it's like a reasonable question that I get. And I historically have not been great at this, but I think reading this book and having this conversation will make it better, which is this is a totally reasonable question. We'll say, well, how long will it take before I know if this is a good specialization for me or a positioning statement for me or a niche for me? And a lot of times I'll answer that with like a range of months. It's like, oh, you'll know when you know, or but I think a better answer would be, well, what's the kill criteria? And have that person define for themselves, instead of me imposing on them, but have them define for themselves how long is too long, or what does traction look like? Like, I know, like when I see traction, I see it. Like people are getting like increased number of DMs on LinkedIn after they change their headline or something like that. It's just like, wow, all of a sudden I'm getting all these connection requests. Like that seems like traction to me. Or I'm getting, a whole bunch of people are sharing my stuff. Or I started getting requests to speak at conferences, like total inbound. Hey, do you want to speak at this conference type stuff? So like that all looks like traction to me. How long do I wait until that happens? And it's like, well, in the past I would be like, sometimes it's very quickly. Other times it's more like 6 months. Sometimes it can take, longer, but that doesn't matter. I'm realizing now that doesn't matter. What matters is you tell me how long you want to try. You tell me how you're going to measure traction or lack of traction. And then I could be their quick coach. So you said that you were going to sink this much effort into this. And if this time period elapsed without X or Y happening, then pivot.
Yeah, because I'm thinking, when I think about clients I've worked with, I can usually tell if it's going to happen fast, and it tends to happen faster if the pivot is a culmination of so many other things that they've done, that it's like the thing that they always wanted to do but never said out loud. Those tend to come really fast. But I've also seen it happen really fast with somebody who's new to the space, because they have a fresh set of eyes and they're calling out the things that the people who've been in the space don't. Mm-hmm. And those are often the folks who tend to have a little bit of imposter syndrome. And it's like, the first thing I want to do is go wipe that away, because you are out there talking about things that other people are not talking about, and you're seeing this kind of reaction. So It's just it's so much as possible if we allow ourselves not to stick with everything that we start.
Yeah, I mean, I wish it was as simple as saying, I think this is important to say, like, you have permission to quit. It's like an option. It's always an option on the table. Always. There might be consequences. That might be emotional, might be reputation, might be financial, but it's always a choice. It's like always one of the options on the table. And you've got permission I hereby give you permission to quit. Right?
Here's your permission slip.
Yeah, you're not a bad person, right? So the combination of the, quitters don't win and the sunk cost stuff is, to me, is like a brutal 1-2 punch that routinely encourages people to stick with things for too long.
Mic drop. Let's stop it there.
Oh, look, we're at 58 minutes. Like, my mouth just automatically goes for 60 minutes every time. Imagine that. That's weird. Cool. All right, folks. Well, that's it for this week. I'm Jonathan Stark.
And I'm Rochelle Moulton.
And we hope you join us again next time for The Business of Authority. Bye.
Bye-bye.